June 14, 2024, 2:37 p.m. The moment my life ended, no one even looked up from their phones. The lawyer's office was made of glass, cold, clear, merciless. I sat at the long table while my sons leaned back in their chairs, smiling as if they already knew the ending. The lawyer opened the folder, his voice flat and practiced. Last will and testament of David Collins. Amount, $30 million. My hands tightened on my handbag. I could hear the soft click of Vanessa's nails on the table, impatient. To my son, Eric Collins, I leave the construction companies. To my son, Lucas Collins, I leave the restaurant franchises and properties. A pause. A silence that seemed to stretch forever. And to Mrs. Margaret Collins. The lawyer cleared his throat. This personal envelope. He placed it in front of me, yellowed, unsealed, weightless. Vanessa laughed first. Well, at least you'll have somewhere to keep your cookie recipes, Mom. Their laughter echoed against the glass. I didn't say a word. 45 years, every night of worry, every account I balanced, every meal I cooked while David built his empire, all reduced to this, an envelope no one wanted to touch. I remember the texture of it. The faint smell of dust and ink. My name written by the same man who once swore we'd share everything. But as their laughter faded, something inside me shifted. Because they thought that envelope was empty. They thought I was too. They were wrong. If you want to hear what came next, stay with me. Because silence can be the most dangerous inheritance of all. My name is Margaret Collins, though for most of my life I was only ever called David's wife, Eric and Lucas's mother, or simply Mom. That used to be enough. For 45 years, I believed that love, loyalty, and hard work were the same as security. I thought devotion was its own kind of wealth. I met David when he was 26, all raw ambition and restless ideas. He wore the same 2 shirts all week, drove a pickup that coughed smoke, and dreamed about building something big enough to make people remember his name. I believed in him long before the world did. When he couldn't afford the down payment on his first construction truck, I sold my mother's gold bangles, the last heirlooms from her village in Ireland. I didn't hesitate. I thought we were investing in our shared future. That truck became 3, then 10, and then a fleet. The company grew, and with it, our family. We built a house in Palo Alto. I managed the books in the evenings while the children slept. I brewed him coffee at 3 in the morning when he was drafting contracts. I knew every supplier by name, every invoice by number. Yet on every paper, on every deal, it was always David Collins, sole proprietor. I told myself it didn't matter. We were one. Our sons, Eric and Lucas, grew up surrounded by success. They went to private schools, learned to golf before they could drive, and spoke of inheritance before they understood responsibility. Eric, the older one, cold, deliberate, obsessed with control. Even as a boy, he treated people like pieces on a board. He could charm an investor, but never once asked how I felt. To him, family was structure, not love. Lucas was different, softer on the surface, but careless. He laughed easily, spent quickly, promised everything, delivered little. He had his father's smile, but not his discipline. Between them, I became invisible, the quiet woman who made their world run on time. Still, I believed in keeping peace. David liked the order of our home, the way dinner was served at 6 and bills were paid before they were due. He used to say, "You keep the ground steady so I can build the towers." I took that as love. Maybe it was, once. But power is a slow poison. Success hardened him. The man who used to hold my hand under the kitchen table during family dinners began spending nights in hotels for business. He stopped saying we. Everything became mine. And I let it. I thought it was loyalty. In truth, it was fear of being alone, fear of starting over when I was already 65. When he fell ill, the house changed. Eric began managing the companies, temporarily. Lucas oversaw the restaurants. They spoke to me like a guest in my own home. I would walk into David's office and find papers turned face down when I entered. Numbers whispered, then silenced. One night, I went to check on David. He was asleep, pale under the soft hospital light we'd installed in his study. As I turned to leave, I heard Eric's voice in the hall, low and sharp. When Dad's gone, everything's ours. Mom won't understand a thing. Then Lucas's careless laugh. She won't even notice. My heart stilled. For a moment I thought I'd misheard. But when I stepped back into the light, they both fell silent, eyes wide, faces calm. Eric poured himself a drink. Lucas pretended to check his phone. I forced a smile. Everything all right? Eric's voice was smooth. Of course, Mom. Go get some rest. That night, I lay awake listening to the slow hum of the refrigerator downstairs, that same sound that had filled our home for decades. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, understanding, for the first time, that the air in our house had changed forever. After David's funeral, everything unraveled quietly. The phone calls from my sons came only when they needed my signature or my consent. Eric's tone was clipped, professional. Lucas stopped visiting altogether. Vanessa, ever polite, began dropping hints wrapped in sugar. You need rest, Margaret. Somewhere calmer. You've done enough. A week later, a glossy brochure arrived in the mail, the Golden Oaks Senior Living Community, where comfort meets care. The front showed smiling women holding yoga mats, all in soft pastels. There was a note from Vanessa inside. Just think about it. You'd have company. I smiled. I thanked her. I even made tea for her next visit. But something inside me was already breaking, or perhaps finally waking. I had spent 45 years building a life for others, only to realize none of them had ever planned to keep me in it. That was before the will reading. Before the envelope. Before I understood how completely they had erased me, and how deeply David had underestimated me, too. Because what they forgot was that I was the one who built the foundation beneath everything they owned. And I knew exactly where the cracks were. The night I truly understood my place in my own family did not come with shouting or slammed doors. It came on soft feet, like a thief, while the house was quiet and David's breathing rattled faintly from the bedroom down the hall. He had been home from the hospital for 3 days, insisting he wanted to be surrounded by his things. His things, not ours. His office door stayed shut now, the oak panels reflecting the hallway lamp like a barrier I no longer dared to cross without knocking. That evening, I carried a tray of chamomile tea down the corridor, the cups trembling just slightly against the china saucers. The clock in the foyer had just chimed 10. I remember because I counted each chime like a prayer. As I approached the office, I heard Eric's voice through the door, low and firm. Once Dad's gone, everything's ours, he said. The companies, the properties, the accounts. Mom won't understand a thing. Lucas gave that familiar, careless laugh that used to charm his teachers and waitresses. She won't even notice, he said. She still writes checks at the grocery store. She thinks an app is a starter. They both laughed. My hand tightened around the tray handle. One of the spoons clinked against porcelain, a tiny betrayal of sound. I froze in the half-dark hallway, staring at the thin line of light beneath the office door. Eric's voice dropped to a whisper. We need it clean. No complications. Harold handles the main will. Vanessa found that clinic in Arizona. Once they sign off, Mom's managed. Managed. Such a simple word. Used for assets. Used for crises. Used for elderly relatives you don't want to bother with. Lucas shifted, his chair creaking. She's not stupid, Eric. Just sentimental. Give her a nice room, people her age, and she'll say thank you. She always does. They moved closer to the door. Instinct pushed me backward, my feet gliding silently across the hardwood. I retreated to the shadows by the stairs, holding my breath like a child hiding from a game she never agreed to play. The door opened. Light spilled into the hallway. Eric stepped out first, tall in his pressed shirt, smelling of expensive cologne and stress. Lucas followed, scrolling his phone. If she starts asking questions? Lucas murmured. Then we remind her how tired she is, Eric replied. How much responsibility is too much now? We'll handle everything. It's what Dad would want. They walked right past me, not seeing me in the dim light, or perhaps not bothering to look. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The tray in my hands felt suddenly ridiculous, 2 cups of tea for a man who had built an empire and 2 sons who were already circling it like vultures. When they turned the corner, I finally exhaled. I stood there for a long moment, the grandfather clock ticking steadily behind me. Managed. The word echoed in my chest like a warning bell. I could have confronted them right then. I could have stepped forward, asked what they meant, forced them to look me in the eye. Instead, I did what I had been trained to do over decades of marriage and motherhood. I swallowed it. I walked to the office, nudged the door open with my hip, and set the tray down on David's desk. He was asleep on the leather sofa, his breath shallow, his once strong hands limp at his sides. I tucked a blanket around his shoulders and whispered, "They're already dividing everything, you know." He didn't stir. On his desk, papers lay in neat stacks, edges perfectly aligned. I resisted the urge to straighten them further, to peek underneath. For years I had respected his privacy, convincing myself that trust meant not asking too many questions. That night, I understood that my silence had not been noble. It had been convenient for them. When I left the office, the hallway felt colder. The family photos on the wall, the boys in their school uniforms, David cutting the ribbon at his first high-rise, seemed to stare back at me with unfamiliar faces. In the kitchen, I poured both cups of tea down the sink. The steam rose and disappeared, leaving the cups empty and clean. It was a small act, pointless to anyone else. But as the warm water washed away the tea, I realized something inside me had begun to erode too. A fine, almost invisible crack had formed. Not in the family. In my obedience. That night I did not sleep. I lay in bed listening to the refrigerator hum. Beside me, the other half of the mattress stayed cold. David had chosen to rest in his office again. Around 3 in the morning, I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with my checkbook. I listed every bill I still paid, every quiet task I handled without applause. When the sky began to pale, the page was full. My handwriting looked steady. My hands did not. One thought settled in, quiet but firm. It stayed on. If they are planning my future without me, then I need to start planning my future without them. After the funeral, the house fell silent in a way that didn't feel holy. The flowers wilted faster than I expected, and the sympathy cards became clutter, stiff rectangles of pity that smelled faintly of perfume and obligation. David's absence didn't echo. It simply erased the sound of everything that had once made sense. Eric handled the funeral as though it were a business merger. He stood beside the casket, shaking hands, whispering to investors and contractors who came to pay their respects. I watched him from a distance, seeing not grief but calculation. When people asked how I was, he would answer for me. "Mom's holding up," he'd say, smiling his father's public smile. Lucas was different, looser, scattered. He arrived late, his tie crooked, eyes red but not from tears. He hugged me once, then disappeared outside with Vanessa. Through the church window I could see them smoking by the parking lot, their laughter breaking through the gray drizzle. That was how morning began for me, with laughter on the pavement and my sons looking at me like I was an old document they'd already filed away. The first week after, they came together often, pretending unity. They held meetings in the dining room that used to host Christmas dinners. Now it smelled of paper and printer ink. I would bring them trays of food, out of habit, and stand in the doorway listening to words I barely understood: assets, restructuring, liquidation. Once, Eric turned to me with a thin smile. "Mom, you really don't need to worry about any of this. Just sign the transfer forms when Harold brings them over. It's only technical." I nodded. I'd spent decades nodding. When Harold, our family lawyer, came by with the papers, he looked at me differently, sympathetic but careful, as if afraid of breaking a rule. He said everything was in order. I noticed the stack was thinner than I remembered from previous updates. I asked about the trust fund David had promised for me, but Harold hesitated. "It's being finalized," he said. I thanked him, made tea, and sat by the window watching the fog roll down from the hills. Somewhere in that silence, suspicion began to bloom, not loud, not desperate, just steady, like a low heartbeat. The phone calls changed next. Eric's tone hardened. He no longer said Mom, only Margaret. He called about taxes, signatures, documents that required immediate attention. When I asked questions, he sighed. You're tired. Don't overthink. We're just keeping things efficient. Lucas stopped calling at all. The restaurants, he claimed, demanded too much time. But I saw the headlines, Collins dining expands to Nevada. His photo, smiling beside new investors, filled a glossy magazine that arrived in my mail. My name wasn't mentioned once. Vanessa started visiting, her perfume always arriving before her voice. She would look around the house with a gentle pity that felt rehearsed. You should rest, Margaret, she'd say, adjusting the vase on the counter as though she owned it. Somewhere calm. Somewhere you don't have to think about all this business. One afternoon, she left a brochure on the kitchen table, thick, glossy paper showing pale blue skies and women in linen pants holding yoga mats. The Golden Oak Senior Living Community, where comfort meets care. I traced the embossed gold letters with my finger. At the bottom, written in her careful handwriting, just think about it. You deserve peace. That word, peace, stung. I'd spent my entire life keeping peace, swallowing storms before they broke. What I wanted now was truth. I started noticing small things. The locks on David's office had been changed. My key no longer fit. The family accountant stopped sending me monthly statements. When I asked, he said Eric had requested streamlined communications. One morning, the gardener told me the property title had been transferred to a new management firm. I smiled, thanked him, then went inside and sat very still. The air conditioner hummed softly. I realized I was being moved gently, politely, but unmistakably out of my own life. Days blurred into quiet patterns. I watered the plants, answered no calls, and memorized the sound of my son's voices on voicemail. Mom, it's just paperwork. Don't worry, we'll handle it. You should really consider that place Vanessa showed you. Each message layered over the next until they all sounded the same. But sometimes, in the small hours before dawn, I caught myself whispering, not yet. I began to look through drawers, old files, the safe David had once told me never to touch. My hand shook, but I opened it anyway. Inside were tax returns, blueprints, and contracts, years of our lives in tidy folders. I found my name only once, on an old company registration document from the 1980s. My handwriting beside his. I ran my finger along the ink and felt tears press behind my eyes, not from sadness, but recognition. I had existed there once. On paper. In purpose. The next day, Vanessa came again. She brought flowers, lilies that smelled too sweet. You need rest, Margaret, she said softly. Eric's worried about you. We all are. I looked at her and smiled. Tell Eric I'm fine. I'm just finding my footing. She blinked, uncertain of what I meant. She left soon after. When the door closed, I stayed by the window for a long time, watching the sunlight crawl across the marble floor. I thought of David, his promises, his empire, his silence. And I thought of my sons, carving my life into pieces while still calling it care. The air felt different that day, charged, fragile, expectant. Something inside me was changing. Not anger, not grief, something quieter. A calculation. Because peace, I realized, was not given. It was reclaimed. And I was just beginning to remember how. The day of the will reading began with courtesy and ended with something colder. June 14, 2024. The sky over downtown Palo Alto was a flat, bright blue. Eric had sent a car, so you don't have to worry about parking, Mom. I sat in the back seat with my old leather handbag on my lap, the same one I'd carried to David's first bank meeting. Back then, the bag had held hope and loan papers. Today, it held tissues and a small bottle of heart pills. The law firm occupied the 20th floor. Everything was glass, chrome, and quiet money. Eric walked ahead of me through the corridor, talking into his phone, already giving instructions. Lucas drifted behind, scrolling, restless. Big day, huh, Mom? He said, giving my shoulder a quick pat. Relax. Dad took care of everything. I only nodded. I had learned that my questions never changed the answers. They led us into a conference room with glass walls and a long polished table. The air was too cold. The leather chair felt stiff beneath me. At the center of the table lay a brown folder. Harold, The estate attorney sat at the head, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "I know this is a painful moment." Painful. As if that word could carry 45 years. Eric took the chair beside him without being asked. Lucas sat across, pen in hand, though I doubted he would write anything down. Vanessa sat next to Eric, perfectly composed, perfume faint but insistent. Harold opened the folder. "Last will and testament of David Collins," he read. "Estimated estate value, $30 million. Silence settled around the number. "To my son, Eric Collins, I leave full ownership and control of Collins Construction Group and associated entities, valued at approximately $12 million. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eric's mouth tighten in satisfaction. "To my son, Lucas Collins, I leave all restaurant franchises, hospitality ventures, and their respective properties, valued at approximately $8 million. Lucas let out a breathy laugh, half relief, half triumph. Harold went on. Houses, investment accounts, vehicles, the apartment in Barcelona, the lake house in Tahoe. Each item was assigned smoothly to Eric or Lucas. Each address he named felt like a room I had cleaned for years being quietly locked from the inside. Then Harold stopped. The paper rustled. "And to Mrs. Margaret Collins," he said, glancing up briefly, "this personal envelope." He reached into the folder and produced a small, yellowed envelope. No seal, no notation of value, just my name in David's handwriting. He set it carefully in front of me, as if it were fragile china. For a moment, I waited for more. A mention of a trust David had once promised over late-night coffee. A line about my security, my home. Something. Nothing came. Vanessa laughed first, a short, surprised sound. "Well," she said, "at least you'll have somewhere to keep your cookie recipes, Mom." Eric's lips twitched. Lucas laughed outright. The sound bounced off the glass walls and came back thinner, meaner. I looked down at the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. My hands, veined and steady, framed it on the table. I could feel Harold watching me, uncertain. "There are no additional bequests to Mrs. Collins listed in this document," he said formally. "Mr. Collins instructed that this envelope be delivered to you personally at the reading." Lucas leaned forward. "That's it?" he asked. "No annuity? No separate account?" "Assets are distributed as described," Harold replied. Vanessa's eyes slid toward me. David was old-fashioned, she murmured to Eric. He believed in providing for his sons. The room shifted. Not literally, but in the way people's attention moved on without me. Harold began to outline tax implications, timelines, signatures. Eric asked pointed questions about controlling interests and pending deals. Lucas wanted clarification on the liquor licenses tied to the restaurants. Vanessa took notes as if she, too, had inherited something important. No one asked me if I understood. No one said my name again. While they spoke, I studied the man whose signature was being read aloud from every page. David Collins. Builder, founder, patriarch. On paper, he looked complete. There was no trace of the woman who had cooked his meals, counted his invoices at midnight, and listened when he doubted himself. Not even in the footnotes. Humiliation did not hit like a slap. It seeped in, slow and cold, settling in the spaces between my ribs. I reminded myself to breathe. In. Out. I thought of the night I sold my mother's bracelets. Of the years I drove him to job sites because he was too tired to trust himself behind the wheel. Of the times I soothed crying children alone while he negotiated contracts in distant cities. None of those sacrifices appeared in Harold's neat stack of pages. In that moment, something quiet in me hardened inside. That night, after the will reading, I drove home alone. The driver Eric had sent earlier didn't wait. He said he had another client. I didn't argue. The city glimmered through the windshield, gold and glass, indifferent. When I reached the house, the air inside felt different, emptier, almost echoing. The envelope lay on the passenger seat, weightless yet impossible to ignore. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet. 45 years of partnership, loyalty, labor, all boiled down to this thin, yellowed piece of paper. I made tea, though I barely tasted it. The steam fogged my glasses as I traced the familiar loops of David's handwriting to Margaret. No date, no note, no flourish. For a man who had once planned everything, it was strangely careless, or perhaps deliberate. At 11:47 p.m., I finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet folded twice and a small index card with a number written in blue ink. The sheet carried David's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. What you find here is only the beginning. They don't deserve to know the truth. But you do. Below it, a string of digits. A bank account number. My pulse quickened. I picked up my phone and dialed the private bank number printed on the back of one of David's old statements. The woman who answered had a calm, unbothered voice. Good evening. May I have your name, please? Margaret Collins. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Of course, Mrs. Collins. Please hold while I access the account. The silence stretched. I could hear my own breathing, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock. Then she returned. Yes, Mrs. Collins. The balance on this account is. She paused, confirming the figure. $100 million. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Excuse me, I whispered. $100,362,520. The account was established in your name, with your husband's signature as co-founder. It has been inactive for several years. My throat tightened. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. For a long moment, I couldn't feel my fingers. Then, slowly, clarity replaced the numbness. Not joy. Not revenge. Just clarity. David had hidden this. Not from the world, from them. My sons, so eager to divide, to erase me, had missed the one thing that mattered. I looked at the clock again, 12:03 a.m. The start of a new day. For months I had been shrinking, apologizing for existing. That ended here. I pressed my palm flat against the note, feeling the texture of the paper, the indentation of his handwriting. For the first time in years, I stopped shaking. It ends now, I thought. The next morning, I called Harold, the private attorney David had once trusted above all others. Not the family lawyer, the real one. The man who handled the hidden deals, the sealed contracts. Mrs. Collins, he said, his voice cautious, I was wondering when you'd reach out. He arrived that evening. The sun was setting, streaks of orange washing the marble floors. He carried a small metal safe. Your husband anticipated this, he said quietly. He left instructions only for you. We sat at the kitchen table. He placed the safe between us, spun the dial, and opened it. Inside were files, thick, organized, sealed in plastic. A second envelope lay on top, marked in David's handwriting, for Margaret, when the truth is ready. I unfolded the letter. If you are reading this, it means they showed you what they are. I kept the company alive, but I also kept you protected. You own 51% of every holding through a silent trust. I hid it under a separate name, Marjorie Ellis. That is you. I needed to keep it from Eric and Lucas. They are not ready for power. They will destroy everything if they take it too soon. My breath caught. David had known. The documents inside confirmed everything. Copies of corporate shares, signed transfers, sealed authorizations, all in that alias. For years, my name had lived quietly behind his empire, invisible but powerful. Harold handed me another folder. There's more, he said. Evidence. Your husband gathered proof of what your sons have done. Inside were photographs, bank statements, text messages. Eric's signature on fraudulent transfers. Lucas in meetings with men tied to drug trafficking in Nevada. And worse, letters of payment to a private clinic in Arizona. The note described a planned psychological evaluation of me. Goal: establish incapacity. Transfer authority to guardianship. My chest tightened. They had already prepared to declare me incompetent. To have me signed away like an unwanted asset. Harold's voice was steady. Your husband feared this might happen. He wanted you to be safe. These documents make you the majority owner of the Collins empire. Everything runs through you now. I didn't speak for a moment. I looked out the window at the dark garden. The night air shimmered faintly against the glass. I suppose it's time I start acting like it, I said finally. Harold gave a small nod. I'll prepare the transfer papers. When they come for you, be ready. I looked down at my hands, still trembling, but no longer from fear. For the first time in months, I felt control return like breath after drowning. The woman they thought they could erase was the one holding everything. And this time, I wasn't going to warn them. The next morning began like any other, sunlight spilling across the marble floor, the smell of ocean air drifting in through the half-open window. But the house no longer felt like theirs. It was mine again. Every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture, every ledger in David's study belonged to me now, not through sentiment, but through signature. I brewed a pot of coffee, the same way I had for decades, but this time I drank it slowly, not in service to anyone. On the table sat the metal safe Harold had brought the night before, still open, its contents spread before me like puzzle pieces finally revealing their image. I read every page until the sun reached the kitchen counter. There were corporate deeds, stock certificates, and notes from David's private accounts. Each one confirmed the same truth. Marjorie Ellis, my hidden alias, owned 51% of everything the Collins family possessed. Every contract Eric had signed, every restaurant Lucas opened, technically, legally, quietly, ran under my authority. It wasn't revenge that steadied me, it was order. After years of silence, I finally understood that clarity was power. Harold returned just after noon. He carried a black briefcase and the same calm expression. Mrs. Collins, he said, I filed the control documents under your alias and your legal name. The transfer is complete. How long before they notice? I asked. Not long, he said. They've been monitoring your movements. I'd advise caution. He opened his briefcase, producing a set of new papers. Power of attorney, he said. One in your name. One revoking the fraudulent document your sons have been preparing. My pulse quickened. They've already filed something? Harold nodded. The Arizona Clinic. The evaluation is scheduled for next week. They plan to declare you unfit, citing signs of dementia and emotional instability. I closed my eyes. For a moment, the betrayal pulsed like a fresh wound. But then a strange calm followed, steady, deliberate. What do we do? I asked. We document everything. I'll file a restraining order preemptively. I've also arranged a recorder app on your phone. When they come, you'll have proof. I smiled faintly. You've thought of everything. Your husband did, he said. When he left, the house fell into that old, familiar hush. I moved through each room, collecting things that were mine by memory, my mother's gold bangles from the jewelry box, David's first construction plans, a framed photograph of the boys when they were small, standing barefoot in the backyard mud. By evening, a courier arrived with another delivery, a thin black folder sealed in wax. Inside were final legal confirmations, notarized signatures, and one more letter from David. If you're reading this far, Margaret, it means you've chosen yourself. Don't let them make you small. The company was built by our hands, but its future belongs to your judgment. Protect it from greed, even if that greed carries our name. I held the letter to my chest for a long time. There was no apology in his words, but there was respect. For me, that was enough. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I transferred key accounts into new management systems. I called the bank and froze all executive transactions. Then I drafted an internal memo to the Collins board, identifying myself as majority shareholder and requesting an emergency audit. The language was simple, factual, irrefutable. By the third morning, I was ready. At 9:12 a.m., a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched Eric step out in a navy suit, followed by Lucas in jeans and sunglasses, and a man in a white coat carrying a clipboard. Vanessa trailed behind them, clutching her designer bag like armor. They didn't knock. They walked straight in. Mom, Eric began, voice syruped with concern, we've been so worried about you. Lucas added, you've been confused lately. Forgetful. We thought it might be good to have someone check in. The man in the coat extended a hand. Dr. Miller, he said. His eyes started nervously. I smiled. Of course. Why don't we sit in the living room? As we walked, I pressed the small red button on my phone recording. Harold's voice echoed in my mind. Document everything. The doctor began asking questions. Do you know what day it is? Yes, I said. June 17th. My wedding anniversary. Eric blinked. That's not what you expected me to remember. I interrupted softly. Lucas shifted uneasily. Mom, we're just trying to help. I set a stack of photographs on the coffee table. Before we continue, I said, I'd like to show you something. The top photo showed Eric at an underground casino, chips piled high beside him. The next, Lucas shaking hands with a man later arrested for drug trafficking. The third, Vanessa, arm in arm with her business consultant, a man whose name appeared in several of David's old ledgers. Vanessa went pale. Where did you get these? Eric demanded. I looked at him calmly. From your father. Then I turned to the doctor. You might also want to know, I said, that you've been paid $5,000 to declare me mentally unfit. That's a felony. His eyes widened. I don't know what you're talking about. Harold, I called. The front door opened. My lawyer stepped in with 2 officers behind him. The room froze. The doctor stammered, this isn't. Eric's voice cracked. You can't do this, Mom. Oh, I can, I said quietly. Because unlike you, I still do things by the law. The officers led the doctor out. Vanessa backed toward the door, clutching her purse. Lucas stared at the floor, shaking. Eric stood rigid, colorless. When the door closed, the silence that followed was almost gentle. I suggest you get your own lawyers, I said. You'll need them. None of them answered. Outside, the sound of the ocean carried through the open windows. It was steady, endless, like the hum of truth finally surfacing. For the first time, I felt no need to raise my voice. The house, the empire, my name, all of it was mine again. And I had no intention of giving any of it back. The days that followed didn't explode. They tightened, like a noose made of paper and signatures. The morning after the failed evaluation, Eric called again and again. I let the phone ring until I grew tired of the sound and finally answered. Mom, listen, he began, voice brisk. You're overreacting. That doctor situation got out of hand. We can still fix this quietly if you stop letting Harold get in your head. Quietly, I repeated. Like sending me to Arizona and taking my name off the companies? That was to protect you, he said. Investors need stability. You're not equipped to manage this. You've never handled high-level operations. I looked at the open safe on my desk, at the documents proving my majority control. I kept the books when you were still learning to hold a pencil, I said. Every invoice, every contract. You built your career on numbers I balanced. He fell silent. I've frozen your executive access, I continued. From today, you may not sign anything on behalf of Collins Construction without my written consent. The board has been notified. You can't just. I already did, I said. You'll receive the paperwork this afternoon. The audit files are very clear. His tone hardened. You destroy your own son's career? I'm asking you to rebuild it honestly, I replied. Whether you do is up to you. He hung up without saying goodbye. Lucas didn't call. 2 days later, he appeared at my door, thinner than I remembered, his usual easy smile gone. Mom, he said quietly, I heard about what happened. With the cops. With Eric. With me. You mean with the men you met in casino backrooms? I asked. With the money that vanished from the restaurant accounts? He winced. I thought I could fix it. The Vegas people, they're not patient. The DEA's been asking questions. Sit, I said. We took our places at the kitchen table. I pushed a folder toward him, statements, photographs, summaries Harold had prepared. You're going to rehab, I said. A real facility. You'll cooperate with investigators. You'll give names. If you refuse, this file goes to them without your cooperation attached. Tears filled his eyes. Are you cutting me off? No, I said. I'm finally doing what I should have done when you first started running from consequences. He gave a shaky laugh. You sound like Dad. No, I answered. Your father protected the business. I'm trying to protect you. He agreed. Harold made the arrangements. 2 days later, Lucas left in a plain sedan. At the curb, he hugged me, shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. Then prove it, I said. Every day after this one. Vanessa came next. She arrived in a tailored dress and dark glasses. Her lawyers had already sent Harold a letter demanding recognition of her marital interest in the estate. "Margaret," she began, seating herself without invitation, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I've always wanted what's best for you." The clinic was about support, not control. I placed a folder between us, copies of her emails to the Arizona doctor, notes about selling the main house once Margaret is placed, and photographs of her with the man listed as a consultant. Color drained from her cheeks. "You can sign the divorce settlement," I said quietly, "and leave with what you brought into the marriage. Or we can let a prosecutor decide what attempted fraud against an elderly woman is worth." "You wouldn't do that," she whispered. "For years, I wouldn't have," I replied. "That is why you thought this would work." Her hand shook as she signed. When she left, the scent of her perfume lingered briefly, then vanished. Eric fought the longest. He hired attorneys, challenged my capacity, tried to rally the board. But the audit spoke louder than any story he could invent. Forged signatures, company funds funneled into private accounts, gambling debts disguised as consulting fees. Facing prison, he accepted a deal. He resigned from all executive roles, surrendered his shares, and agreed to a monitored repayment plan. Harold found him a position on one of our own sites. Not in an office on the ground. Junior supervisor, reporting to a foreman who had poured concrete for David in the early years. On his first day, someone sent me a photo. Eric in a neon vest, hard hat slightly askew, boots in the dust. I saved the picture anyway. I didn't remove my sons from my will. I rewrote it. They would no longer inherit control of companies they had tried to steal. Instead, they received conditional trusts, sums released only if they stayed sober, employed, and law-abiding. If they wanted wealth now, they would have to earn it, piece by piece. They had gambled on my weakness and lost. I did not gloat. I simply stopped cushioning their fall. For the first time in their lives, the consequences of their choices belonged to them, not to the woman they tried to erase. A year passed before I realized I'd stopped counting days. The calendar on the kitchen wall still showed June, though it was already late August. Time had softened its edges, no longer divided by crises or phone calls demanding signatures. The house was quiet again, not empty, but peaceful, like it was finally breathing in rhythm with me. The papers were all in order. The companies ran smoothly under a board I trusted. I read every quarterly report, initialed every contract, and refused any meeting that began with condescension. At first, the men in suits hesitated when I entered the room, then they began to stand when I did. Respect, I learned, wasn't asked for. It was enforced through consistency. Each morning began the same way, coffee in my favorite blue mug, the one with a small chip near the handle, the scent of salt air drifting in through the kitchen window, and the sound of gulls sweeping over the Pacific. The view had been there all along, I'd just been too busy surviving to see it. I kept the dusty envelope in a frame on my desk. A reminder, not of humiliation, but of transformation. When I touched the glass, I remembered that day in the lawyer's office, how small I had felt, how their laughter had echoed against the glass walls. That echo no longer haunted me. It fueled me. After the legal storm settled, I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to consider in years. What do I want, now that everything is mine? The answer came quietly, as most truths do. I wanted to build something that wasn't about power or legacy, but dignity. So I founded the Golden Years Foundation, a small nonprofit aimed at supporting older women who had been manipulated, abandoned, or financially erased by their families. I started with my own savings, not the company's money. Harold helped with the paperwork. Lucas, newly sober and working part-time with a rehabilitation outreach group, helped organize logistics. At first, only 3 women came to the first meeting. They sat shyly in folding chairs in the community hall near the marina. One brought banana bread, another carried a folder of unpaid bills, and the third just needed someone to talk to. I listened. Week by week, more women came. Some from mansions, some from small apartments, all carrying the same invisible bruises: betrayal, dismissal, silence. They had been told they were too old, too naive, too emotional to manage their own affairs. They reminded me of myself the night I opened that envelope, steady hands trembling over proof of their worth. I told them what I had learned, that silence was not weakness, that trust without verification was surrender, and that self-respect could be rebuilt like any structure, one beam at a time. By the end of the year, the foundation had funded housing for 6 women and provided legal aid for 12 more. Each success felt like a quiet revolution. Meanwhile, Eric served his sentence not behind bars, but under sunlight. He worked 6 days a week at the construction site, earning back the trust he'd traded for greed. The first time I visited, he looked thinner, humbled, but sober. He wiped his hands on his jeans before shaking mine. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't think you'd last," I replied. He smiled faintly. "I'm learning." "Good," I said. "Keep learning. There's dignity in work done right." Lucas called every Sunday from the rehab center, voice steadier each time. He spoke about helping new arrivals, teaching them to cook healthy meals, finding meaning in routine. I could hear the tremor of sincerity in his voice. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was progress. Vanessa sent no messages. I knew she'd remarried someone younger, wealthier, equally self-absorbed. I wished her neither harm nor luck. She belonged to another chapter entirely. At night, I often sat on the terrace overlooking the water, wrapped in David's old wool cardigan. The ocean stretched wide and indifferent, yet I found comfort in its constancy. It never apologized for its tides, it simply returned, again and again. Sometimes I imagined David beside me, not as the man who had hidden the truth, but as the one who had finally trusted me enough to reveal it. I no longer needed his approval, only the peace of understanding. We had built an empire together. In the end, he had given me the tools to reclaim myself from its shadow. I had spent a lifetime serving others, husband, children, appearances. Now my days belonged entirely to me. I tended the garden myself. I painted the upstairs room in soft cream and hung photographs of women from the foundation, each smiling, each unbroken. Every evening before bed, I opened the balcony door and listened to the ocean. The same sound that had accompanied my solitude now sang of freedom. My hands, once used to balancing ledgers and smoothing tablecloths, now built futures slowly, steadily, for women who had forgotten their strength. The empire my family tried to steal was never the prize. Clarity was. And I guarded it fiercely, not with anger, but with peace. When people asked how I'd survive such betrayal, I smiled and said, by finally believing that survival was something I could choose. That was my new balance, not wealth, not control, but choice. A woman who chooses herself cannot be erased. Not anymore. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I still take that dusty envelope from the drawer. The paper has yellowed further, edges curled, my name faint but visible. When I touch it, I no longer feel humiliation, only recognition. That single, weightless envelope once carried the truth I needed to rebuild my life. I keep it beside my desk as a reminder. Silence can be armor, but it must one day become action. For years, my silence protected others. Now, it protects me. The house feels different now. Lighter. I open the windows wide, let the sea air move through every room. The ghosts that once haunted these walls have gone quiet, not because they've vanished, but because I've finally forgiven them their smallness. Eric visits sometimes, his hands calloused from real work. He brings flowers, not excuses. Lucas writes postcards from his recovery center, short but honest. "Still learning, Mom," his last one said. I pinned it on the fridge. I don't ask for more. People change slowly, if at all. But I have learned to measure love not by what is promised, but by what endures. The foundation continues to grow. Every month, another woman walks through our doors, some frightened, some furious, all of them tired. I tell them what I know. That fear fades when you name it, that shame loses its grip once spoken aloud. And that even when everything is taken from you, your will, your quiet, steady will remains. Sometimes, during those meetings, I see pieces of myself in their stories, the loyal wife, the invisible mother, the woman others mistook for a footnote. But I'm not a footnote. None of us are. At night, when the ocean hums beyond the terrace, I think of David. I've stopped asking why he did what he did. Maybe guilt guided him, or maybe love in its most complicated form. Either way, he gave me a second life, even if he never meant to. The fortune, the empire, the legacy, they no longer define me. The only wealth worth keeping is peace earned honestly. Because you should never underestimate a woman who has been silent for too long. She isn't broken. She's waiting, learning, gathering her strength. And when she finally speaks, she doesn't ask for justice. She is justice. If my story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength.